Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we have a drawing of Catherine Winnick as Lagertha from the Vikings, and I'm going to be showing you the drawing process, but before I do I just want to share with you a couple of tips when drawing hair, because this hair was a little bit complicated. It was not easy for me at all, and if you have a nice reference photo, and I did have a high quality reference photo, there can be a lot of detail in this, and it can be very daunting. Now, there are a couple of things you can do to make it easier for yourself. The first thing that you need to try to do is maybe use a lower res photo, or zoom out, or even squint your eyes a little bit. That way you can try to focus on the larger segments in this hair and not get too caught up in the details, because there will be a lot of flyaway hairs here, a lot of overlapping segments and all kinds of things going on, which can be very confusing. So what you want to do is try to focus on the larger segments. And another thing, don't worry too much if it's not the same. What you're trying to do is convey the general idea. So here we have some braids, here we have a side parting, here the hair is kind of wavy. So as long as you capture these general things, I think you should be fine. Now the other thing are these flyaway hairs here, and these add a lot to the realism of the hair, the overall realistic appearance of the hair. And what you want to do is draw these with a lighter or thinner pencil. I did a lot of this in charcoal or a black colored pencil. You can do these with a harder graphite pencil or something, but the thing is that there are lots of them, and in order for this to look realistic, you have to draw a lot of them, because they have to look a lot more dense, they have to overlap, etc. And in order to do that, you can't really draw every single hair. It would look kind of artificial, and maybe you can, but it would take a lot of time. But what you can do is you can use one of your blending tools, like a brush or a tortilla, and you can just soften the edge of the hair here and push that charcoal or graphite, whichever it is that you're working with, push it towards these fine flyaway hairs, and that way you can create an illusion of their density. Now normally I stress that you should have a clean edge where the subject ends and the background begins, but here you can break that rule, and this blurry edge can actually create a more realistic looking hair with lots of these flyaway hairs. So these are a couple of tips for drawing hair. Now we're going to move on to the video of the drawing process. Let's have a look. So I'm going to be using a combination of pencils again, because even though I mostly work with charcoal, I like to use graphite and a black colored pencil as well. With charcoal I use charcoal pencils and vine charcoal, and I am using a graphite pencil here for sketching. So now I'm going to move on with a charcoal pencil and some vine charcoal. I'm going to use the charcoal pencil to create some of the basic shapes, and to separate some of the segments in this hair, to start creating some indications of these braids. And because the charcoal pencil is a little bit darker and a little bit less difficult to move, these lines are going to stick, and when I go over them with vine charcoal, they're still going to be there, because vine charcoal is a little bit lighter and it's a little bit more easy to move around. Now at one point it will seem that the hair that I'm creating is too dark, because she is blonde and has very light hair. That's not a problem, because the hair will eventually appear lighter for two reasons. First, because I'm going to be drawing some highlights on it, and second, because I'm going to be shading the face, and once the face is shaded, the hair will naturally appear lighter. Now, like I said, I had a high quality reference photo with a lot of detail on both her face and the hair, but I decided to use a lower res photo in addition to that one as well, because in the lower res photo it was kind of easier for me to see the shape and the structure of that hair without getting caught up in too much detail, because some of it can be a little bit confusing. So it's a good idea to simplify. And one of the things that I said in the intro is also that you don't need to try to make it look exactly like the reference photo, exactly like the original. You can just try to simplify a little bit, but make it look like keep the general shape, the general idea. So you can see the hair still appears a little bit too dark. I still need to draw a few highlights here and there. And you can see how I'm approaching this. I'm basically using the vine charcoal for the mid-tone. I'm using the charcoal pencil for the darker areas. And I'm using a pencil eraser to create those lighter areas so that I can give those braids and those segments of hair more of a 3D look so that they stand out. And here, as you can see, I'm moving on to the eyes, mostly using a sharp medium charcoal pencil and a bit of soft charcoal pencil for the darkest areas like the pupil. I'm going to try to create a nice highlight in the eye, a reflection in the eye, and I'm going to keep it white and draw around it in order to create a sufficient amount of contrast so that this reflection would stand out and be a lot brighter than the rest of the eye. I'm also shading the area around the eyebrows and around the in between the eyes. So I'm doing the same thing with the nose and the mouth. I often like to put in some of the darker lines and some of the darker areas on the face before I move on to shading the face, because with these lines here around the eyes and things like that, I'm pretty sure that I'm not going to be modifying them much. So I want to put in those darker areas because I know that they are going to be there. But the rest of the face is going to require a lot of shading, and that's going to take a little bit of time and patience, obviously, because you need to build up the value in certain areas very gradually, so that I could convey the shape of the face to the viewer. And here I'm using a vine charcoal stick to lay down some vine charcoal in some parts of the face which need to be a little bit darker. So on the sides of the nose, on the sides of the face, under the eyebrows, under the jaw, under the chin. And once I do that, I start spreading that charcoal with a soft brush, just pushing the charcoal from the shaded areas towards the white areas and creating some mid-tone, some basic tones, trying to separate light sides, light areas from the shadow areas, and trying to create some basic indications of shapes on her face. Now this is the initial stage of shading where everything still looks kind of flat. And another tool that I sometimes use for blending is a Q-tip. It works pretty well in addition to the brush, and maybe gives you a little more accuracy and a little more control. But as you can see, in comparison to the face, the hair is starting to appear a little bit lighter, and I'm going to be shading the face a lot more. So I'm going to be shading the face using some other pencils. I'm going to be using a black colored pencil and a graphite pencil. And I like to use a black colored pencil in combination with charcoal, but the thing to remember always is that you can use a black colored pencil on top of charcoal. It's a little bit difficult to do it the other way around, because the black colored pencil is kind of waxy and it would be difficult to go over it with charcoal. That's why I like to lay down some of the work with charcoal before I move in with other types of pencils. But I don't know how much you can see it now because a lot of this is in time-lapse, but I'm mostly using a tapered stroke for the shading. I'm basically gradually shading some parts of the face by adding a little bit of value, mostly using a tapered stroke and some cross-hatching, and then I go over that with a brush to soften those lines so that I don't have too much texture. But this way of shading gives me a lot more control, and this is important for me, especially when drawing female faces, because they tend to have a lot more of these smoother transitions, so I can't really approach them in the same way that I approach male faces, rough faces and things like that. So I'm making sure that I shade the sides of the nose as well, because what often happens is that the nose ends up looking too wide. But she does have an unusual shape of the nose, which I will try to capture as best as I can. So you can see how once I've done a little bit of shading with a black colored pencil, the face is starting to take even more shape in comparison to what I've initially done with the vine charcoal, and it's starting to get a little more volume and depth. It's looking less flat than it initially did. And this part of the process is probably the crucial one and the one that takes the most time and patience. If you're wondering what the brands of the pencils I'm using are, well, I'm using Warrison woodless charcoal pencils, and the black colored pencil that I'm using now is a Faber-Castell black pencil. In addition to that, I will also be using the Staedtler HB pencil, which I used for the sketch as well. So I modified the shape of the eyes and the eyebrows a little bit to make it look more like the actress. And I often use a Tortillon as a drawing tool as well. Here my footage went a little bit blurry, so some of it is not of great quality. But I'm still hoping that you will be able to see most of the details. Another thing that often happens to me is that I forget to turn on the lamp, so that the light is often coming from my window to the right. And when I use artificial light, the footage tends to be of better quality. So I'm adding some more detail to the lips and fixing the shape of the lips as well, and adding a little more shading to different parts of the face. So the corners of the mouth needed a little more shading. Occasionally, if I feel like there's too much texture, I can soften everything with a brush. And I can also go back in with a pencil eraser to pull some highlights on the face or on the hair to make some of the lighter areas stand out even more. I feel like there's also more shadow under the lower lip and on the sides of the face. And to quickly add more value, I can add some vine charcoal, but I can also go over that with a black colored pencil later. Another advantage of a black colored pencil when I use it over the vine charcoal is that it can produce a little bit of texture. So if I feel like I want a little more texture in some areas, maybe to imitate the texture of the skin, I can just use the black colored pencil and not blend it as much, and it will give me a slightly more rough texture. So here, this part of the hair is a little less complicated. It's just kind of wavy and overlapping in some places, so no braids there. So this gown that she was wearing had a kind of a hood on, and initially I wasn't really happy with the way that was turning out, so I'll later modify that. So here on the hair I'm adding some darker areas to give it more depth, some darker areas in between those segments of hair. So this area here, there was some kind of a hood there, and that's why this upper part of her gown was supposed to be darker, but I didn't really like the way it turned out. Sometimes when you try to isolate something on the paper, especially when you're doing a vignette like this one, it can be a little bit difficult to explain certain things to the viewer, so it's better to simplify. So I decided to simplify her clothes a little bit. I'm just going to make it more even in terms of tone, and I'm just going to create some shadow under the hair here and around her shoulder, and I'm going to blend that and soften that with my finger, and that's about all that I'm going to do with it. I'm not really going to bother putting in too much detail in there. So whenever you have a chance to, whenever you're in doubt whether something will end up looking good, you should simplify, especially when it comes to clothes, jewelry and things like that. There's no need to create something that'll look horrible and be distracting at the same time. I want the viewer to focus on the face and on the portrait. And you can also see that I started adding a few of these flyaway hairs on the hair, on the edge of the hair to the left. I'm going to be adding a few more of those as well on the other side. So I'm just adding a few more details at the bottom here on her hair. Even though, like I said, this is a vignette, so I want the bottom part to fade towards the edge of the paper. And I'm adding some flyaway lighter hairs around her shoulders using a pencil eraser, as well as adding some highlights on these segments of wavy hair. Again, I used a pencil eraser for those to make them stand out. So I'm just gonna add a few more hairs and a little more work around on the sides of the face. I added those earrings, and because it was difficult for me to get a high contrast, I used a little bit of white gel pen. Normally I would try to reserve a white space for that, but it was kind of difficult to plan that. So I'm going to be moving on to the other side. And I feel like the right side of the face still needs a little more shading, so I'm back to shading the face. The hair on the right, by the way, is going to be a little bit simpler, so we have some braids on the left. Here on the other side it's kind of, I wouldn't say slicked to the side, but it kind of looks like that a little bit with a parting on the right side. But it is a little bit simpler, I think, and I'm going to simplify it additionally because I can't really be bothered to draw every single hair or every single segment of hair. I'm just going to shade the mouth, the ear a little bit, and maybe add a few more details on the hair. And then I'm going to be moving on to these earrings. To create those, to make those earrings look nice and realistic, I'm going to again have to create some areas of high contrast to make it look like they're made of metal, so that we have some shiny lighter portions. And I'm just going to add a little bit of vine charcoal on the rest of her clothes, and the part near the neck is going to be a little bit darker, as well as under the gown on the chest, because there's a little bit of shadow there. Here I felt that I needed a little more shading on the side of her face, so I used a graphite pencil to add just a tiny bit of value. And by the way, I used that same graphite pencil to pull some of these flyaway hairs on the top of her head. And like I said, I used a little bit of brush and tortillon to soften those as well, to soften the outer edge of the hair, so that it would appear a little more realistic, and so that these flyaway hairs would look a little more dense. So I'm just adding a few more touches of shading here and there. I feel like the jaw and the chin need just a little more shading. The thing is that you can't really understand everything that's on the face all at once, so sometimes it takes a bit of time for you to shade the face and to understand its shape. And it's also always a good idea to step back from your drawing to see if some areas of the face appear too light or too dark. Because when we step away, we can see the relationships between areas of larger areas of lighter and darker value. I'm cleaning up some of the edges and maybe adding some darker details here and there, as well as cleaning up my drawing. I need to decide where to sign it, and I think the signature should go in the lower right part of the paper. So there it is. I kind of felt like the eyebrows were just a little bit too dark because she has lighter hair, so I used a pencil eraser to take away a little bit of the value, to make them just a little bit lighter. And I further refined their shape a little bit with a black colored pencil. But that's pretty much it. The portrait is finished. I hope you like this drawing. Check out my other videos, and bye for now.